I actually believe that nutrition science, when people say that, oh, it got so bad in nutrition because the tobacco companies bought the nutrition companies, but I actually think it's the other way around. Nutrition scientists, the big UPF, the early UPF, ultra processed food companies like Standard Biscuits, Heinz, uh, they formed in 1940 an organization to try, its goal was to influence nutrition science, which is to get science at its start, fund it, influence the scientists. And they have been employing these, with let's call them cancel tactics.
Right.
They're the original cancel culture in nutrition science. The problems with tobacco, the tobacco industry in their playbook didn't come along until much later. So I think the direction of causation may be very much that food companies figured out this first. They figured out how to cancel people successfully. They figured out the playbook of smearing people and other kinds of the culture of consensus, or the creating so much confusion in the scientific press that people don't understand. There's always a counter study to that will
Right.
create confusion, so you can't get any kind of clear hold on what something might say. I mean, I have stories of that going back to the 1930s. I think the food industry was the original. Uh, they invented cancel culture in science. It's something I'm interested in writing about, because I think what you see is that that only came along in tobacco and when the 70s or 80s. By then, the food industry already had a 30-year head start on them.
That's so fascinating. What an interesting reframe to go back that long and understand that something that feels relatively new has been being done in many different ways, just probably more amplified now because of social media attacks, but it's been a long-term playbook. It's this culture of conformity or consensus that you speak to. What do you think that is? Because you've been on the inside, right? You're a scientist, you're an academic, you have a PhD. It seems that some people break away from it. Some people are able to break free, and other people just kind of like herd mentality. Is it this manipulation, and is that driven by companies getting in ears, and is it profit driven? Is it something else? Like, you've probably done a lot of thinking about this. What do you think creates that obsession with controlling the narrative and keeping this, keeping it the same, the fear of change? What is that?
I would say there are many causes to that drive a culture of complacency or defense of the status quo in
Hmm.
science. One of them is just simple, most charitably, is just simply cognitive dissonance. People don't want to change their minds. They especially don't want to change their minds if they spent the last 30 years of their lives trying to prove or working on a certain issue. They're not going to be especially open to overturning their life's work, right? So I think that is a major part of what you see in science. There's also built into the scientific, the world of academic science is the culture of preservation of ideas. So that, let's say I'm Walter Willett at Harvard, very influential scientist. Who do I choose as my proteges and the people who I'm going to sponsor? Who do I get invited to meetings? Who do I assure gets research funds? Who do I assure gets publications in journals? Those are the people who think like me. And I sort of hand the baton off to them. And the people who are challengers quickly discover how unrewarding that career choice is. They don't get invited to conferences, don't get research funding, don't get papers, don't colleagues don't want to work with them. You are a pariah in your field. And I document quite a few cases in my book of people who, who are at the top of their field and therefore more in a better position to make challenges. A guy like George Mann, who was one of the leaders of the Framingham study, a huge, important government study run by National Institutes of Health. But he was, as he told me, pulled into the hall when he was greatly opposed to the Ansel Keys and the idea that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol cause heart disease. Because one of the famous things that Dr. Mann had done was to go to Kenya and document the lifestyles of the Maasai warriors, and discovered they're eating, 60, 70% of their diet was animal fat, and they were in spectacular health, right? But he, one day at NIH headquarters, was called into the hall by a secretary who said, if you're going to continue your opposition to Ancel Keys, you will lose your research grant. And Dr. Mann, who was fierce and principled, did not stop his opposition and did indeed lose his research grant. And his volume of Framingham, which is the one volume on nutrition, where it found that saturated fats did not, in fact, have any link to heart disease. That is the one volume in, I forget how many, maybe 26 volumes, whatever, however many volumes there were in the Framingham report. His volume was the only one to go unpublished and sit in an NIH basement.
Wow.
So it's very clear to people in the field of science that being a challenger is deeply unrewarding. And usually it means the end of your career and your inability to do science. So there's a self-perpetuating mechanism that happens in science, not just nutrition science. I'm sure this happens elsewhere. And it's also why this theory of change that we sometimes hear about from Thomas Kuhn, that we need a generation of scientists to die out, and then the new group will come in with new ideas and we'll be able to change a paradigm, I think is almost entirely untrue. I mean, what we saw in nutrition science is Ancel Keys, the original saturated fat is bad for you guy, literally handing the baton to Walter Willett, who then carried it along with him for the next 50 years. And then Walter Willett is handing it off to Frank Hu, or handing it off to like any number of other people. Those ideas continue, and they're reinforced by the whole system that produces scientific work. I think another factor, undeniably, is the influence of the food companies. We talked about how they started that in 1940. Add to that the pharmaceutical companies whose profits come from chronic disease, long time disability, people being on 4 to 5 medications every single day for years and years and years and years, as the average American is. That is a profit model for them. And when I started off researching in nutrition, I truly could not understand why so many nutrition scientists were funded by pharmaceutical companies. I just thought, why is pharma in here? Like, so naively. And I realized that's because they are, I don't think they're paying them off, but they're saying, instead of looking at diet, look over here. Let's look at these. Let's look at this formula-based weight loss company. Like, in the 2020 Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, that's the expert committee that makes the guidelines, the guy who was the medical director of OptiFast, currently employed as the medical director of OptiFast, was working on that committee. If he's invested in a formula-based solution, how is he going to take really a serious interest in diet?
All right, friends, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Radical Health Radio. We got a fresh new podcast for you every Wednesday. If you enjoyed the show, consider liking, subscribing, reviewing, and rating us on your podcast platform. It helps us spread this message of radical health. We'll see you next week.